Hello, class. This is the extended lesson 2-4, and I want to give you a little bit more detail on a number of topics. One, the politics, just the political situation during Jesus's day. I want to give you a little bit more detailed background as to what led up to the situation in Jesus's time. But in addition to the politics, I also want you to be aware of what was the practice of Judaism at that time. What was it like? And also, what were the important groups, social groups, and leaders? And a lot of these you will hear referred to in the New Testament, and you need to know about them so you can understand what role they play in interacting with Jesus as well as some of the other disciples. And then also, what were some of the important writings that Jesus himself was acquainted with? Certainly, he knew the Old Testament, but there are other writings. And so I want to begin by screen sharing with you just some details regarding the political background. So let's start with that. And I want to talk to you about the fact that, as we already mentioned in class, that Israel or Palestine was mainly controlled by other countries. We know that much. Excuse me. But also, there is a very, very strong sense of Jewish identity that continues. They're very proud of being Jewish. They are, after all, the chosen people of God. The only reason they exist as a nation is because God chose them, starting with Abram, who became Abraham. And we know that Palestine as a land, when finally the southern kingdom, the remaining kingdom of Israel, that would be Judah, when it fell in the mid 500s, Palestine had basically been under Persian occupation from the mid 500s up until around 331 BC. And from 331 BC all the way to 166 BC, they were under the Macedonian and Seleucid rule. That is one of the subsequent kingdoms from Alexander the Great's epic worldwide kingdom, until the year 166, when a group of Jews revolted. And that's what we're going to look at next briefly. And that is a family, a leading family, the Hasmonean family. And this family ruled Palestine for about the next 100 years, from 166 to 63 BC. And then from 63 BC onward, the Hasmoneans were still involved with the rule of Palestine, but they were under the thumb of the Roman Empire as Rome broke into the region and decided to make Palestine basically a colony of sorts. They allowed local leaders to continue to rule. For example, we have Herod the Great, who happened to be a descendant of the Hasmoneans, and so he was acceptable to the local Jews as a leader. His sons, Herod's sons, also led and ruled the various regions. We have, for example, Herod Antipas ruling the regions of Galilee and Perea. And then there are several other regions that are ruled by Philip. And then Archelaus ruled Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. But he was so incompetent and ineffective that he was eventually replaced by Roman procurators, governors, and the fifth of which happened to be Pontius Pilate, that we know of. And so that's why I wanted you to understand a little bit more about the background of Roman rule. So they didn't directly rule, but through descendants of the Hasmoneans, as well as procurators like Pontius Pilate, local Roman governors. So that's the political situation. They are very intentional about remaining Jewish, but they are under the rule, of course, of Rome. What about the practice of Judaism, though, in Jesus' day? Let's take a look at that. Well, there are a few key principles that need to be highlighted if you're going to understand how, in between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of what becomes the New Testament, that about 440 year period, what had Judaism become? Well, a couple of principles need to be highlighted. First of all, It was clear that God, the only God there is the one who had chosen the Jews to be his people. They still have a deep sense of being God's chosen people. Now, they also believed deeply that God had promised them the land of Palestine. This was what had been originally promised to Abraham. And so this is why that land belonged to them, even though they were under the thumb of Rome. Thirdly, they also believed, thanks to the scriptures, that God would send a chosen one, an anointed one, a Messiah who would defeat, at least at their point in time, the Romans and bring peace to their land. Fourthly, there were, since the fall of Judah, there were developed these synagogues, these buildings that helped to unite the Jews. This is where Jewish communities scattered all throughout the ancient world, the ancient Near East, and as well as throughout the land of Palestine, where people would come together for regular instruction, all the way from the Babylonian captivity to today. When I say today, I mean during Jesus's day. And of course, synagogues still persist to this day. This is where the scriptures are read and where people learn them. Speaking of those scriptures, it is the law, the Torah, that unites the people. It is especially the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But there are other books as well. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. And so I want to take a look at the fact that there are other important groups that are involved. For example, you have first and foremost the Pharisees. And the Pharisees literally are named for an Aramaic word that means separate or separate. And they are the ones who taught the people to be faithful to Moses' law. However, their problem was that they erred on the side of what we would call legalism, kind of a blind following of the law. And another group would be the Sadducees. They are a priestly aristocracy. They, as I said, they are both priests, but they happen to have a bit more, if you will, cachet, a bit more status than what the Pharisees would have. And they, in contrast to the Pharisees, rejected a lot of what they believed. One of which they believed was the existence of what we would call the resurrected life. So they did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees, that is. And that plays into the fact that later on, Jesus has a conversation with some Sadducees who certainly do question the resurrection, and Jesus confronts them on that. Another group that you need to know about would be a ruling body called the Sanhedrin, which was a Jewish governing council made up of both Pharisees and Sadducees. And then there's another group that you need to know about, because one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. And the zealots were mainly a political group that believed that you were supposed to advance God's cause by any means necessary. And so, we're talking that they believed even in the use of terror to do so. The Herodians, they were predictably that political group that were supporters of Herod, of King Herod, and his sons as well. And the Samaritans, well, they were a racially and religiously mixed groups. They were half Jewish and half other ethnicities. And this dates back to the time of the captivity, where Jews were intermingling with some of the people groups that had captured them. And so they weren't viewed as truly the people of God. And as a result, Jews and Samaritans despised each other. And that plays into the story, the parable that Jesus even tells about that we call the Good Samaritan. So these are some of the important groups you need to know. But there are some important writings you need to know about as well for understanding Jesus' world. For example, of course, there's the Old Testament. And of course, the main feature of the Old Testament would be those first 5 books that we know of as the Torah, the law. Another group of books are known as the Apocrypha, that date to the time period of around 200 BC to even a little bit past. Some of them are written past the time of Jesus, up to 100 AD. And these are a collection of 14 books that essentially discuss the history of the Jews as well as their religious ideas. And also, there is the pseudepigrapha, dating from 200 BC all the way up, again, past even Jesus' time, but still it was present during his time to 200 AD. And these are various works that provide good insight on Jewish thought. And finally, you have what are called the rabbinic writings, perhaps the most famous of which, it's called the Talmud, essentially. And it provides a rabbinical, they are the teachers of the law, an explanation of the Old Testament. And some of these explanations were just flat out criticized by Jesus. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 4, you see Jesus challenging some of these writings. Now, Numbers 2, 3, and 4, the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, and the rabbinic writings are not treated by Jesus as Scripture, and nor does the New Testament treat these writings, number 2, 3, and 4, as Scripture. But they do help us. The reason for knowing about them is they do help us understand the times and can serve as helpful spiritual reading material and further insight into some of what's going on at the time. But I want to end on this note. And I want to come back to the fact that we are now transitioning into the New Testament, specifically the Gospels. And I want to remind you of what we covered in class about the overwhelming manuscript evidence of the New Testament. A few things that I want to just come back to. The fact that the Gospel was written, and the Gospels, I should say plural, were written when those who knew Jesus were still alive. In other words, they could cross-check and make sure that the gospel record was indeed accurate and true to what they themselves had witnessed. 3 of the 4 gospels were linked to the first disciples. For example, Matthew and John. They were actually disciples of Jesus. Mark relied on Peter's recollections, and Luke also relied on various eyewitnesses, and we can see that as he opens his own gospel in Luke chapter 1. But ultimately, what I think is really important to understand is that God himself oversees the writing of the Gospels. He himself is the one in charge. All Scripture, even its recording, is God-breathed. And we see that the New Testament affirms that God's Spirit guided and inspired the whole process. You can see that in the book of 2 Timothy, for instance, chapter 3, verse 16. So that's what I want us to at least cover as we make this transition into the New Testament and specifically to the Gospels.